that really me? Or just who I used to be? And is that how I want to be remembered?
But the million-dollar question is, how do Oliver, Mabel, and Charles want to be remembered, and will making a movie about their well-known podcast be their legacy? Only hours removed from solving the murders of 2 crimes last season and putting on the final touches of their recording, our trio is hit by a mysterious power surge. But little do they know, this was the final act of Sazz's murder, which will be a key moment of the final scene of this very episode. As they head up to Charles's apartment to celebrate their recent victories, we see that Charles brings up the strange disappearance of Sazz, but they initially dismiss this as Mabel gets an email from a Bev about their podcast. They speak about the flaw of their business being that they always need someone to die in order to continue their podcast. They discover that Sazz never left with the alcohol. As Charles tries to impress by showing off his new electric bottle opener, we see that the cork shoots across the floor as Mabel notices blood on the oven door, but doesn't think too much of it at the moment. As we slowly pan out through the window hole left from the killer's gunshot. We are officially back with my weekly coverage of the show that I've covered since the very start, as it is so good to be back as we have another murder to solve for this 4th season of Only Murders in the Building, and we'll be breaking down this first episode. Full spoilers ahead. Now, before we continue, we have to acknowledge a few things about this opening scene. 1, there's no time jump between season 3 and 4, and we immediately pick up after the events in the finale of season 3. 2nd, that random power surge wasn't that random, as Oliver brings up that the incinerator being the cause of the surge before it was actually banned. Now, we'll discuss why it was turned on and who was in it a little bit later, but it is very important to note that the person or persons clearly moved the body before they arrived. Again, I say persons because maybe the person who made the shot wasn't the same person who moved the body, and also this person has to be very familiar with the building well enough to know that there was an incinerator in the basement. And lastly, I find it very interesting and quite strange that the trio just got an email from this Bev just moments after Sazz's death, which doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Now, we're not even past the opening scene and I'm already breaking out the theories. Oh yeah, it is so good to be back. As Charles is now in bed, he puts on what many consider to be not only one of the greatest westerns of all time, but one of the greatest movies ever made, which also seems to be a huge thematic connection to this season premiere, but also maybe this season in general. Now, while on the topic of films and the influence of this episode being from Once Upon a Time in the West, was it me or did this episode feel and look very cinematic at times? Like, I think about how the camera was used in this episode and the different angles and the wide sweeping shots and the actual look and feel in this episode. It felt like it was a much bigger episode, and it just felt very cinematic in my opinion. As Charles gets his day started, the sounds of the whistle begins, but he's not able to place where the source is coming from until a little bit later in this episode, as Oliver and Mabel arrive to tell him the bad news that Death Rattle Dazzle is officially dead. Now, I could be reading this completely wrong, but was it implied that someone turned the TV off and removed Charles's glasses when he fell asleep? And also, when he woke up, did someone put on the tea in the kitchen? Was that just a normal circumstances? Was it Charles who took off his glasses, turned off his television, put the tea on the stove? Or was it implied that the killer might have been in his actual apartment? Again, I encourage you all to re-look at that scene and look at Charles's face, because to me, it read like he was surprised that all these events took place. Now, despite the one good review that they wanted, we find out that the rest of the reviews were just okay, as we learn that Donna and Cliff have pulled their finances out to focus on their murder case, leaving Oliver wishing that he was dead. As Charles tells them that he believes he's suffering from a brain tumor because of the whistling noise, as we see Howard enters and shows off his new adopted puppy by the name of Gravy. Howard mentions how Gravy was a working girl before and pitches a podcast to Mabel, but it is interrupted by the dog barking out of nowhere. Yet again, another email comes in from Bev as they start to put the pieces of the puzzle together that this is actually a legit executive from Paramount Pictures who wants to make a movie about their podcast. Now, Charles is very concerned about Sazz's whereabouts and doesn't want to go to Hollywood until out of nowhere, someone pretending to be her texts him and makes up an excuse about why they had to leave at the last minute because they're in LA shooting another show. Now, of course, Oliver being Oliver, he takes that as an opportunity as a sign for them to take this trip to LA to hear out Bev's pitch.
West Coast is calling all of us, Charles, clearly. Pack your bags, bitches. We're going to Hollywood.
The trio has arrived to La La Land as they're on the studio lot, as we see Charles and Oliver want to take the lead on this meeting for the studio because they've had past experiences with the studio system before. We watch as they're greeted by applause as we officially are introduced to Bev and her team, who I'm sure we're going to get to learn more about as this season progresses. As they learn how far along this movie has come, they find out that the movie already has a cast, it has a release date for this Christmas. They also have directors who are identical twins who go by the name of the Brothers Sisters, and there's also a writer attached by the name of Marshall, who I have my eye on, who we'll discuss a little bit later, as we see Bev describing the trio or how they're going to be written on the page.
Oh, you are all so distinctive on the page. Oliver, who we all want to strangle and cuddle at the same time. Charles, everyone's unfun uncle with his grouchy little turtle face. Mabel, with your traumatized, homeless, jobless, mumbling millennial charm.
Now, I personally definitely got a nice little chuckle from this scene. I'm just imagining that while this was definitely heightened for more comedic purposes, there's definitely some groundedness to what was going on in this moment. You have to imagine that when it comes to viral sensations online or overnight success, Hollywood just comes in, swoops them up, and wants to make a show or a movie about their lives, about their success overnight, and all they have to do is just sign their life away, and we see this happening in this very scene, but they also want to shoot this movie right away. As we see Charles doing his funny number on the paper bit, as him and Oliver seem to be ready to sign this deal, but Mabel's got some reservations. Now outside, we see Mabel explaining why she had to leave the room, as it really kind of hurt her feelings how she was described as someone that doesn't really have too much purpose at this point in her life, which is clearly something she doesn't want to be described as forever. This also sparks Charles, who was called on fun, set his sights on this LA tour and visiting Zazz's apartment on the way there, as Oliver doesn't want to put the pressure on Mabel, but we see he definitely does that in this moment. I'll admit, the Mabel storyline has gotten beaten to death, and they keep making it seem like she's good, like she's on a good path of finding out who she wants to be, and this whole murder-solving business has gone well for her, but yet again, we find her confused on what she wants to do with her life in this very moment. Now trust me, I'm a Mabel fan, I love that character so much, but I just hope that this season doesn't do the same thing that we've seen before in previous seasons. I hope they do something different with their plot, and please, for the love of God, no more red herring love interest for Mabel this season, please. As they arrive to the Sunset Swan, a place where all the celebrities reside, did you all catch this line by Charles?
I lived here during season 1 of Brazos, before Sazz took over my lease.
Okay, so we've talked about this in the past breakdowns, where I personally feel Sazz and Charles definitely have a love-hate relationship. Whether it be finding out that she took over his lease, whether it be her taking over his previous relationships, Jam being the most recent, I hope that we get to explore their past relationships and how it could have led to her potential death. As they arrive to her front door, they notice that there's a stack of mail there that clearly points that she's not home at the moment, but also shows that she hasn't been there for a while. As yet again, Charles hears the whistle coming out of her apartment. Oliver brings up that maybe she's shooting an episode with Scott Bakula, who we'll talk about later, as Charles agrees and promises to let it go and have more fun as they decide to go to the party. As they arrive to the party being held on their behalf, we're introduced to the actors who are going to be playing them in the film, as we have Zach Galifianakis, Eugene Levy, and the one and only Eva Longoria. Now for me, this exchange between Zach and Oliver, this moment here got the best laugh out of me, as each of them spend time together learning for the role. For example,
why they aged you up. I did a focus group on the age gap between you and the guys, and the word that kept coming up was creepy.
I have a risky take on your character. I was thinking about maybe playing him talented.
It's now nighttime, and we get to see a little reunion between Oliver and Loretta. As we see them playing catch-up, even though it's only been 5 days, we get this sense that Oliver may be, I don't want to say jealous, but might have this sense of uneasiness or maybe jealousy of her recent success, as she brings up would Oliver consider living with her in LA. Now, he doesn't answer her right away, but I believe this subplot could involve them maybe growing closer together or maybe even a marriage, because it seemed like she was preparing for him to say, "Will you marry me?" But clearly he didn't say that. But if it doesn't end on a happy note, I can also see this going the bad route, which is them ending up breaking up. While we have Mabel having a heart-to-heart as Eva Longoria gives her advice about what she should do with this opportunity and how she should build something with it. Well, we see her take this advice as she approaches Bev, and she talks to her about what is going to take for her to agree to do this movie. Now, we don't see what those terms are in this very episode, but I'm sure it's going to be revealed sooner rather than later, but I'm pretty confident it's going to have something to do with her building her own and having her own purpose. This just makes me think about the conversation that Cinda and her had last season when we saw Cinda approaching her about being a co-host to a new podcast, and even looking at Howard pitching her in this very episode. I said it in last year's breakdown that I think it's safe to assume that by the end of this journey, by the end of this story of self-discovery for her, I think she's going to probably end up starting her own podcast, if not by the end of this season, definitely by the end of the series. Now, during all this, Charles thinks that he sees Sazz, but unfortunately it's his sworn enemy, which is Scott Bakula himself, as he actually doesn't know where Sazz is either because she didn't show up to one of the doubles that they had set up for a new pilot. As Mabel tells Oliver that she will indeed do the movie, we see Charles fills them in on the suspicions he's had about something going on as they decide to go back to Zazz's house and they break in. Inside, we learn about Zazz's joint replacements. They hear a mysterious noise in the background, which I'll be honest, I thought it was strange that they didn't investigate what that noise was, and I wonder if we'll revisit the scene later in the season and see this from another person's perspective. Now, on Zazz's desk, they find a bunch of random notes that have things like West Tower. There's a combo code reading 773440. There's a note reading the long game, and under all this, we see an envelope that reads, "Looking at Charles." Now, one would assume that we'll be learning more about these findings because right now they seem to be very random, but I'm pretty confident they're going to end up on a murder board. But I do want to point out the West Tower and the code, to me, seems like this has something to do with the assassination of Sazz. Was she aware of this person trying to hurt Charles and she gathered all this information on her own? Definitely something I have on my suspicion board that we'll get to here in a second. As Charles gets a call from Lester about the broken glass requested replacement, which most likely was requested from the killer, which, speaking of placement, Charles realizes and places where the whistling came from, as does Mabel remembers when Gravy was barking, as they both decide it is time to go back home. Now, this is what I call a great callback as we go back to the opening sequence of Once Upon a Time in the West, where Charles points out the significance of the first 7 minutes of that film being completely silent, as we see the show kind of recreating that moment on their own silence of the ending of this episode. And we also notice that what's going on in the film is matching what's going on the show in their own kind of unique way. As the trio make notes of the bullet hole, they also take notes of the blood found on Charles's oven as he is texting the person who's pretending to be Sazz, as we have Howard returning with Gravy, who, by the way, remember she was a working girl. Well, I guess it's safe to assume that her job included her using her incredible ability to smell, which leads them to the chute that goes down to the basement. As they're now in the basement, they head into the incinerator, which again is a callback to the opening that someone turned it on, which caused a power surge. As Charles opens the door, he finds some ashes, and in those ashes he finds those joint replacements from Sazz from Bulgaria, as it indicates that she's dead. As they're all there left in complete silence, we see that the person pretending to be Sazz texts Charles back and let them know that he's not their friend. Man, what a chilling and quite terrifying ending, and probably my best moment of this premiere episode. So before sharing my theories, here's my thoughts and review of this episode. Now, I'll be honest, I thought this was a pretty solid premiere episode. I love that we don't skip ahead in time. We didn't miss out on any character moments or any character development. It just picks things up and we get right back in the swing of things, which I actually loved. Now, of course, the trio's chemistry is and always will be the greatest element about this show, and I just love how connected they are at this point in the story. I also thought that the comedic moments really worked in this episode, and again, the ending was incredible, but I do have some criticism. I just have this feeling inside of me that this season can kind of go one or two ways as far as the story being split between LA and New York. Now, for the most part, I've enjoyed most of the guest stars and the cameos we've gotten in the season so far because it's never taken away from the charm of the story. It's just a nice little element to have. But my reservations go into the idea of a guest celebrity cameo popping up in every episode or every other episode. Kind of scares me because it really feels like it's very Hollywood show busy. These celebrities being like TV versions of themselves, being like a heightened version or a mean version of themselves to fit into this show and like being fans of the show. It's a nice little sentiment, but my fear is the show from the very beginning has always been very self-aware. It's always in on the joke, right? But I feel like with these new celebrities popping on every episode potentially or every other episode, it's going to maybe become the joke instead, which doesn't really work for me. But again, I hope that I'm wrong. And again, overall, I feel like this was a pretty solid episode. Now with that out of the way, let's lay the cards on the table as far as my lead suspects. Now I gotta start with my main man Charles, because if you all have been following my breakdowns, I've always had the suspicion that the show has been leading to him being killed off sooner rather than later. Going back to the opening scene of this episode of the real life homemade videos of the actors, but the monologue that Charles says of the idea of who they used to be seems very important to me. I truly believe that we're going to peel the onion back on the backstory of all these characters, but in particular, I think we're going to learn a lot about Charles's background and his past life, both the good and the bad, which again could have led to Zazz's death. And like I said in my season 3 breakdown, go back to episodes 5 and 6 of season 3. Think about those 3 sandbags that almost killed Charles. Think about the episode where Charles went to that closet. He was locked into the closet. I believe that he has been targeted for well over a season now, and it's all coming full circle. But of course, the main topic at hand is who killed Sazz. Going back to one of their last comments towards Charles, we know that Sazz has some sensitive things to talk about, which we don't know exactly what that was. Of course, we have to point out the fact that maybe Charles wasn't the intended target. Maybe it was actually meant for Sazz to die. We all know that she's in a relationship with the killer who's in prison, which I do feel like Jan's going to have some role in this season. But we also know that Sazz seems to be that type of person that finds himself in trouble, and I wouldn't be surprised if Sazz got themselves involved in some type of scheme or some type of payoff with the mafia or someone that can kill people. Or again, maybe Sazz knew something about Charles and maybe she was going to reveal something that ended up getting her killed in protecting Charles, or maybe not protecting Charles. Again, they seem to have they love each other, but they also probably have some hate for each other, and particularly from Charles' perspective, with her taking over most of the things of his life. Now let's take a look at the Hollywood executives that was introduced in this episode, and particularly the Bev character. Now, first and foremost, I thought it was a little bit too on the nose how Bev kept repeatedly saying that she's going to do whatever it takes to make this movie happen. And of course, as the audience, we think, well, if she can do anything it takes to make this movie happen, why wouldn't she kill Sazz to make the crew want to do another podcast, to make the movie about this very killing? But then that's the problem right there. The show has already played that card with Donna and Cliff. They were the producers of Oliver's play, and now have an executive producer being the producer of the movie who wants to kill to make the movie happen. It seems a bit redundant to me. So right now, I don't think Bev is involved, but I wouldn't be surprised if some Hollywood corruption is going on, which actually leads me to the writer Marshall. I thought it was very interesting that he used the words that he's just a fly on the wall. To me, in that moment, it plays in that scene, but I think about that meaning of fly on the wall. What has he been doing? What kind of research has he been doing to take on these characters to write them? How closely has he been paying attention to our trio? And last but not least, it could be a mysterious person. Maybe we haven't met this person. Maybe there's someone of Charles's past. Maybe we haven't even seen them in this episode, or maybe they've been in front of us this whole time. So there could be a mysterious person involved, which we'll find out in the weeks ahead. That's going to be the end of this week's breakdown of the return of Only Murders in the Building. Next to watching this show, this is my next favorite part about covering this show, and that is reading you all's comments. Make sure to leave your thoughts on how you all felt about this premiere episode. What worked, what didn't work, but also share your Easter eggs, share your deeper meanings you all took away from the episode, and also, more importantly, share your theories about who you all think is the killer or killers of this season. I'll be back every week releasing my thoughts and breakdowns after each episode, so please hit the like button, share this video to anyone and everyone you know that loves the show as much as we do, and also please consider subscribing to the channel and hit that notification bell, that way you don't miss any of my future content around this show. You all are awesome, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.
Yeah.